Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's web ANR and compact lesson in photography. My name is Sawi Manusope. I'm a communications specialist serving the Southern California counties, and I'm based out of the South Coast Research and Extension Center in Irvine. Now, before I turn it over to Ethan Ireland, our senior videographer, I'm going to add the link to our communications toolkit. This has been created by the strategic communications team, just so that you all know how the Strat Comms team can continue to support you all. So feel free to bookmark the link. And just a few reminders, this session will be recorded, so you all will have this file to you afterwards. And if time allows, we'll have a Q&A session afterwards. If not, I'll be monitoring the chat, and I'm happy to create a Q&A document with the responses from Ethan and myself and have that sent out, as well as a resources list containing the links to all of the information that you'll see today. So we only have 30 minutes. We're going to jump right in. Ethan, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you everyone again for joining.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me. I'm actually seeing there's quite a few people here, and I'm very pleased that all of you have decided to join for this thing. I am going to jump right into it. So the number one thing I'd like everybody to do is take your hand, reach over and pat yourself on the back, because you are an artist, and I don't want anybody to tell me you're not. Everybody's like, I'm not an artist. I'm just not very artistic. Yes, you are. That's part of being a sapient, sentient being, is we are all instinctually artistic. You can take any child. Every single child is artistic. It's just that after a certain point where our inner critics get in the way. So what I want everybody to do is silence your inner critic and get out of your own way. Video production is something I tend to think of as the 21st century's version of literacy. After a certain point, everybody was becoming literate in the idea of everybody could read and everybody could write to a certain extent. Well, visual communication using video media and photography is becoming as important, if not more so, than communicating through written means. Anybody can look at an image, because we are all human. We are all going to have roughly the same psychological and emotional responses to images that we show us. In fact, visual communications transcend written communications. Everybody's heard the term, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, video is thousands of pictures shown in sequence. So keep that in mind. So with that said, we're all here because you folks are here because you want to learn how to make your visual communication more effective. The other thing I want folks to keep in mind is as you get out to as we have democratized access to video production tools, and it has been removed from the realm of the studio and put into our pockets and a smartphone. Likewise, the audience we are all competing for attention from an audience. And so as we're putting stuff out on the internet, keep in mind that as soon as you bore your audience, you lose them and they're never coming back. So we can complain all we want as educated people, because everybody who's working for ANR is an educated person. Complain all you want about short attention span theater and how the internet has broken the human mind, but that's just the fact is that this is the sea we're living in. So you might as well swim until conditions change. So I'm also, so the other thing I want you folks to keep in mind is I had the very great pleasure when I was 18 years old to get to conduct an interview with Sir David Attenborough, who is a personal hero of mine. And the long and the short of that, I was talking to him as a quote unquote television educator. So the big takeaway from that interview, what he told me, he said, television is not an educational medium. And I was astonished by this, because growing up on PBS, this whole idea that we're going to use television to educate. He said, no, television doesn't educate, it inspires people to become educated. So you don't use your video to educate, use it to inspire people to educate themselves. That was the big takeaway from David Attenborough, and that's one of the reasons why his content is so effective. So keep that in mind. The more you lard down the video with details, scientifically accurate details, the more you're going to bore your audience. They'll educate themselves. They'll take care of that. As long as you make sure that you're accurate in your content, good, but don't overwhelm them with info. We're used to, in writing the kind of papers that we write, working for ANR, like, okay, I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to back it up with all of these, with all of these footnotes and endnotes and citations and sources. And that's all great. You can create a page at the end of your video that has all that if you really want to, but more or less get people interested, and they'll follow and do their own research. Okay. So with all of that said, I would like everybody to start thinking about, we're going to talk about how to keep your audience engaged. So we're going to talk about how to frame our shots in a way that are dynamic, artistic, and people that effortlessly keeps your audience's attention. So the first rule of framing is we don't talk about the frame. But now that my obligatory Fight Club reference is out of the way, I'm actually serious, because all video manipulates reality to a greater or lesser extent. As soon as we start looking through a lens, and as soon as we put a frame around reality, we edit it for our audience, because when we watch something, any piece of visual media, it doesn't matter what, we immediately forget the borders framing it. So like, look at my frame. You guys see this, and I've had a few people ask this question. It's like, oh, are you at home? You must be working from your home office. No, this is my ANR office. And I decorated my frame in here with intentional stuff that I want people to see. You're going to see my Wizards poster. You're going to see my Blues Brothers poster. You're going to see my Blade Runner poster. But you're not seeing that next to my Wizards poster is my poster of The Lighthouse and my poster of The Adventures of Bakaru Banzai. Right? So as far as you're concerned, until I showed you those, they didn't exist. Anything outside the frame for your audience doesn't exist until you show it to them. Everything that's in your frame, you should put in there with intent. It's there because you intend it to be there, and nothing outside the frame exists. That's the number one key. It's just, what we used to refer to as sleight of mind in film class. This is one of the reasons why Georges Méliès, who was one of the very first filmmakers, started off as a stage magician. He was like, oh, great. Oh, I get this immediately. He was one of the first people to create editing and special effects. So moving on, this is, let's see here. I've got a bunch of talking points. Let's take a second and look at some basics of composition. And these basics of artistic composition predate the existence of motion pictures or even photography. These are all things that you'll see used in graphic works of art dating back centuries. And this is one of the very first treatises on how to properly compose a painting, includes all of these things. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, I see some chat stuff here. Okay. So let me share my screen. I'm going to go over to, oops, there we go. Okay, so one of the very first things I'd like folks to keep in mind is something called the rule of thirds. You can see here where it's an animated GIF that's showing the rule of thirds. If you draw a tic-tac-toe, you can see here, if you're the little tic-tac-toe grid drawn over the frame is showing that this tree is lined up with the right third, and the top of the tree is just about to the top third. Now, this goes all the way back to one of the treatises that was written in the 18th century. Now you can see the difference between one that's cropped with rule of thirds and one that isn't. Right here, it says, that's what I just said. Yeah, John Thomas Smith in 1797, Remarks on Rural Scenery. So keep in mind that this is art, right? All rules can be broken. Just know when you're breaking them and why. If you don't know the rule exists, you can't use it to your advantage, and therefore you probably never use it except by accident. The other thing to keep in mind is perspective. Anybody who's taken an art class will probably have heard of perspective. There's a couple of different kinds, 1, 2, and 3-point perspective. And these are all things that make your image interesting, right? We have a single point of perspective. All these lines are going back to it. That's really interesting. That grabs you immediately, and you're like, hey, cool. Like, my eye wants to look at that. Look at all those visible dynamic lines. So imagine if you had your subject standing right there, and talking to you, saying, like maybe this relating something about this tree, because we're ANR, so we're going to be talking oftentimes about about crops or trees or orchards or what have you. But in any event, if you can make your image, if you can make your frame compelling, you will keep your audience. So there's a, hang on, I'm going to switch what I'm screen sharing. I'm going to share this PowerPoint. So everybody should be able to see this. We talked about the rule of thirds. So another thing to keep, one of my favorite filmmakers and one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, Stanley Kubrick. Can everybody see this? Loved perspective. He loved it to bits, and he was always very careful about how he framed things. So you can see there's 3 different shots from Kubrick movies, 2 from Full Metal Jacket, 1 from The Shining. But you can find Kubrickian perspective used relentlessly throughout any of his films. You'll also find symmetry is also another thing that's used quite heavily. Wes Anderson loves symmetry. This is one of his dirty tricks. He also tends to ignore the rule of thirds, but he does it. Well, actually, he doesn't exactly ignore the rule of thirds. He puts them in the center, on a center line. So you will see he will throw that rule out because he more focuses on creating symmetrical images and stacking the frame with things. So you can see how he uses symmetry. Keep all of these tricks in mind when framing your shot. Again, use intent when you build your frame. Don't just have things be there because they happen to be there. If you don't like what's there, try to move it. Move yourself, move your subject. Ask people in your frame if they're walking into your frame to move, be polite, but construct your frame with intent. Moving on, there's also balance. That's another thing to keep in mind. So when we're doing a shot, reverse shot, you have somebody here, nice rule of thirds. You've got a nice medium close-up on both of these people. But if they say, for example, this person was talking to this person, it would also feel kind of weird because they're both on screen left, looking screen right. So this is going to lead me into my next point, which is the line of action. So I'm going to stop sharing and I will share the next thing. I'm gonna brush past a lot of this stuff because I'm just gonna introduce these things. If people are interested in knowing more, I am always happy to respond with questions or respond to questions, email or text, what have you. I'm available on Teams and on Outlook. Okay, so here's another thing. So this is what I mean when I say shot, reverse shot. Okay, from Casablanca. We've got Bogey and Bacall talking to each other. This feels natural, because we've got Bogey on screen left looking right, we've got Bacall on screen right looking left. This is how you frame a conversation. If they were both on screen left looking right, it would feel like they were talking to somebody who's out of frame over here. It would just feel really weird. So that's called a line of action. Now, we're going to take a quick look at different types of shots. That is a single medium, actually that's a single cowboy medium shot. A medium shot is a shot that goes either from just below the subject's rib cage or just at about the subject's hips. It's called a single because you have one primary subject shown in context with the background. Knowing what shots you're trying to get is going to help you, because then you're framing with intent. So psychologically speaking, people are going to look for faces or things that look remotely like faces. There's a reason why when you look at an electrical socket, if everybody grew up using Edison plugged or grounded Edison sockets, it looks like a little human face because we project our faces on things. This is also one of the reasons why anime is very, very popular, is because the faces are generic enough that people project themselves into them. That's just the nature of human psychology. We see faces everywhere. People see faces in toast. This is just the way the human mind works. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the human face, then we'll look at the human body, then we'll look at it in context. That's the way the flow works. Going back to the Bogey Bacall thing, the size of the face matters. It has a psychological meaning to it. So the larger the human face is in the frame, the more intimate and the more emotional it's going to feel. The smaller it is, the more remote and distant distant it's going to feel emotionally. Maybe we're showing somebody in context with their background, and it's more important to show them in context with their background than to show them tight and close. Than to show them tightly and have a deep emotional meaning with that face. It's just like when you're talking to a loved one, you tend to get very close, make eye contact. You fill your frame of vision with their face. That's why we would use close-ups in films, for that psychological reason. We're building an emotional relationship with the subject on the screen or in the frame. Here's a wide shot. Actually, this is an extreme wide shot. This is again from a Stanley Kubrick film called A Clockwork Orange, which is a fantastic film, but is filled with triggers. So if you're a person who has some deep triggers, then probably avoid it, but it is still worth watching. This is the subject. The three subjects in this are tiny compared with this giant brutalist building in the background. This is creating a psychological perspective for the viewer. This is the opposite to the close-up shot that I just showed you. This is an extreme wide shot. We're seeing them in context with a background that feels oppressive and dehumanizing because the character Alexander the Large is being taken in to be psychologically reprogrammed in this specific building. This is the reason why he chose this particular building and this particular framing, was to create this ominous sense of oppression for the viewer, who has, despite the fact that the lead character Alex is a teenage psychopath murderer, you still develop an emotional relationship with this anti-hero, and you kind of feel for him, like, oh, where are they doing with him? Uh-oh. Moving on. Let's talk about two shots. There's a couple of different shots here. This is called an over shoulder, and this is a two shot using symmetry. We also saw two shots in the Wes Anderson piece from earlier. There's another two shot. It's a medium two shot, but using very, very strong symmetry from the Royal Tenenbaums, also a great film. Anything by Wes Anderson is really an excellent piece of artwork. He's one of the greatest filmmakers of the 21st century, and for good reason. Again, three shot. They basically gives you the number of subjects in the film. Usually once you get over a three shot, people stop paying attention. There's too many things to look at. But over shoulder shots are important because they create a context of conversation. So if you have two subjects talking to one another, you want to have them framed. The reason why you choose this medium close-up, actually this is a medium shot on Tony Hopkins here. You would choose something like this because when you're sitting opposite a table with someone, you have that intimate exchange with them. Maybe not as intimate as being face to face, but you're having this exchange with somebody across the table. They let you kind of get down to their level. Now this is also where we get into subjective camera angle. Here's a subjective angle from over the hip. I even call this an over the hip shot. Here's Tom Cruise, and he's looking up at the subject. So we've created a kind of a subjective relationship to him, or whoever's standing in front of him clearly has you would say, a superior relationship to him. I'm not talking about in any kind of moral sense, but I mean, they are literally superior and he is literally inferior. By having a high angle shot looking down on a subject, you make that subject feel inferior, reduced, small, and vice versa. If you have a low angle shot looking up at a subject, you're going to make them feel large, imposing, and emotionally overwhelming. Shot choice has a lot to do with what you're doing. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to switch gears. There's going to be a file that has these links, so you can follow and read up on them yourself. This is just sort of the basic stuff. I'm going to go over a few things to do. Let's go over a couple of pieces of technical photography here. I know I'm kind of throwing a lot of stuff at you. I'm just going to very briefly mention the exposure triangle. These are all things that you can do in settings. So if you take your phone, if you're shooting on your phone, and frankly, it doesn't matter what device you use to capture your image. You can use all of these techniques regardless. It could be your phone, it could be your little Hi8 video camera from 1996 that you for some reason still happen to have. Doesn't matter the tool, you can use all these same techniques and get what you're after. The exposure triangle is some basics of technical photography that if you want to know how to control your image and what they do, what aperture does, what shutter speed does, and what ISO does. So the sensitivity is ISO. Go take a look at that stuff on your own because it is kind of detailed, and if I get into it now, we're going to run totally out of time. So make sure you follow up on that if you have an interest in it. There's 2 links. One of them, this one's kind of busy, so it can be kind of confusing if you're like, I don't know anything about technical photography. You look at this, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I seeing here? But take a second and read through these sites, and then it'll make a whole lot of sense pretty quickly. Another thing to keep in mind is color temperature. You can see that if you've been inside and everybody grew up using incandescent lights, and maybe as we have been transitioning away from incandescent and fluorescent lights to using LED lights, now suddenly more and more people are becoming aware of like, oh wait a minute, color, lighting does have a color temperature. Sunlight is bluer than incandescent light, which is more orange because we use tungsten filaments. Fluorescent light is greener than either is kind of in the green spectrum, and you'll notice this. You don't notice it because your brain tells you what color white is. You only notice it if you've been inside, using lamp lighting, and then you walk outside into sunlight being like, oh, hang on, everything seems different. But as soon as you point a camera at it, it's going to seem weird because you're like, oh, wait a minute, hang on, I thought I lit this person, but they look really orange. Why is that? Well, it's because you're using a tungsten balanced light in a daylight setting, or vice versa. Like I've been shooting inside, I go outside and everything looks blue on my camera. It's because that's why. So you can do yourselves a favor and look up what color temperature is. I've included a link in the I wouldn't say show notes, but you know what I mean. So you can at least get oriented to the fact that white light actually has a spectrum of color in which it appears, from the orange to the blue. And if you're aware of that, you can avoid shooting orange or blue video, which then nobody wants to look at, and then having to do a bunch of correction in post. So those are some things you can do. Let's talk about a couple of other basic things. We talked about rule of thirds, perspective, the line of action and screen grammar, shot types and psychology. Now let's talk for a brief second about camera moves. So the other thing to do to try to avoid for boring your audience is entirely static shots with entirely static talent. So whoever's on, if your subject is static and your frame is static, your audience is going to be bored because it's going to feel like you're having a Zoom seminar, right? I mean, I'm not doing a whole lot, but if I'm moving, right? If I'm moving around, suddenly you're going to pay attention to movement because, again, human psychology pays attention to movement, right? So your moving subject in a static frame is going to be something that's going to keep people's attention. A moving frame, or sorry, a moving mounting of your camera is also something that's going to be keeping frame because that is psychological. A moving frame following a subject that appears static in frame, where so the background is moving, is going to feel more engaging as well. So a tracking shot, for example, if you have a camera that is tracking my movement, it's going to be interesting. There's lots of different ways to get tracking shots. But what you want to try to avoid is static talent and static shots. Try to, if you're going to pan the camera, this is called a pan. This is called a tilt, right? Tilt. And then you can boom up or down to change the subject relative to their background. It's generally better to move the whole mounting of the camera rather than just a flat pan or tilt. But it's always better to have something moving in shot to keep people's attention. Or having, so whether that's the camera moving relative to the subject or having the subject doing lots of physical motion within frame. Again, short attention span theater. If you have a still static shot with still static people, have a reason for doing that, but also don't wear out your audience's attention span because, again, they're going to swipe away to something else and you won't get them back. We talked about dynamic backgrounds, I think, a little bit, but just to touch on it a little, construct your backgrounds to be visually engaging. find a way to find a way to make them engaging. If you're if say you're in our Master Gardeners program, get outside. Don't get right up against a flat white wall. Get outside into your garden. Use the rules of perspective to try to build that frame, and be present with what it is you're trying to talk about. Show close-ups on. So talk with the garden in the background, cut away to close-ups of, say for, I don't know, bean plants or whatever it is that you're trying to catch people's attention on. No, you don't need me to follow you around all day and take your family photos. You just need to just get, these are all, to quote Han Solo, simple tricks and nonsense. These are all just dirty tricks. They're fairly simple and quick to learn. It's just, once you figure them out, you'll have a whole heck of a lot of fun doing it yourself. And I don't want to rob anybody of the opportunity of that feeling of like, oh, I did it, that discovery, like, oh, cool, I just figured out how to do this thing. So yeah, I can do it for you, but then you won't have the joy of discovering it for yourself. So, another thing to keep in mind is if you're shooting on your phone, try to invest in one of these wireless lavalier microphones, because bad sound is also a turnoff for your audience. You might have really beautiful visuals, but if the sound is really terrible, they're just not going to want to pay attention. We have had we have had talkies since 1929 when the jazz singer debuted, and people have come to expect having good sound in their videos. If you have a video without sound, that's called a silent movie. People got over watching that stuff almost 100 years ago. So we're running thin on time. I will be available for more questions offline, but I just wanted to give folks this kind of quick primer on photographic techniques. There's a lot of other stuff that I could say, but I will also be doing this a longer format thing at our statewide conference in April. I'll also be teaching a class there, and where I'll have some more visual aids. But between now and then, I should say, feel free to sign up for that panel. Between now and then, please throw some email questions my way, eireland@ucanr.edu, and I will remain ever at your service.
Thank you so much, Ethan, and thank you everyone for joining. Please expect that resources list following this session, and it'll also include a link to our communications toolkit. You can learn more about Ethan's office hours as well. And thank you, Jody, for planning all of this and putting it together.
Oh yeah, quick note. If anybody is in range of the Davis facility, I have open office hours Wednesdays and Thursdays from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. So if folks want to come in and do a little training session one-on-one with me, we have the whole studio and all the equipment there. And I'm happy to do it. Always happy to teach.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your lunch hour.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you, Sally.
My pleasure. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Okay, take care.